Hello, I'm Dr. Greta Pope of the privatemusicstudio.net, and I'm here to share with you today some wonderful information as part of our Cultural Arts Everywhere program. We're going to talk today about classical composers and musicians of the African diaspora pre-20th century. So this is going to be before the 1900s. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and we are going to get started. I hope that you're going to enjoy it. So give me a moment to share my screen. Classical composers of the African diaspora. Pre-20th century, so that's before the 1900s. And this is part of our Cultural Arts Everywhere programming. People of African descent have been overlooked in many areas, including the area of classical music. It is often said that Blacks have only recently become involved in composing and playing classical music. This simply is not true. There have been many Black composers and musicians of classical music throughout the centuries. Some have been French, some Spanish, some Italian, some American, but they all are of the African diaspora. Some of these musicians were of mixed race, some had been slaves, and some were free Black men. It is time that we recognize and celebrate the existence and accomplishments of classical composers and musicians of the African diaspora. It is time that their story is told. This presentation features a few of the outstanding pre-20th century classical musicians of the African diaspora. English royal records document the employment of John Blanc, listed as the Black Trumpeter. He was paid by the day by both Kings Henry VII and Henry VIII. A pictorially illuminated manuscript of the Tournament of Westminster on New Year's Day in 1511 tells the story. The tournament was commissioned by Henry VIII to celebrate the birth of his son to his wife, Catherine of Aragon. This pictorial manuscript clearly portrays Blanc as a highly respected and well-paid mounted Black trumpeter. In the 16th century, he was earning the equivalent of $60 per day in today's dollars. That was a great deal of money at that time. He was wealthy.
This is the story of John Blanc, otherwise known as the Black Trumpeter. Not much is known about John Blanc due to the poorly documented material of him living and the fact that he lived so long ago. However, what we do know, and what was listed even by Henry VIII, was that he was a highly respected musician. So much so that he even played at the funeral of King Henry VII. Not only was John respected by the royal family, but he was also a free man. For his services, John was paid 8 pence a day by King Henry VII, which is the equivalent of around £22 in today's money. Years later, John created a petition requesting a pay rise from King Henry VIII, doubling his pay to 16 pence a day, so around £44 in today's money. Blanc is also depicted twice in the Westminster Tournament Roll, which shows the celebration of the birth of King Henry VIII's son to Catherine of Aragon. Blanc appears once performing at the entrance of the king and the other playing as the king leaves. To gain an understanding of the importance of such an event, it would be like the equivalent of playing at the Olympics today. What is most incredible about the records of John Blanc is that it documents the existence of free Africans as far back as 500 years in the UK. This challenges the belief that the history of Britain's relations with Africa started with the slave trade. and rejects the belief that the history of Black people coming to the UK began with the Windrush generation. Want to learn more and access our free resources? Follow www.theblackcurriculum.com for more info.
Our next composer is Ignatius Sancho. He lived from 1729 until 1780. He was an African composer and author whose published letters tell much about his life. He was raised in a house as a slave in Greenwich, England. He taught himself to read and educated himself very broadly from books owned by an aristocratic family with whom he obtained employment as a young man. 62 of his short compositions survive in 4 self-published volumes. Here is Sancho's Minuet. Up next, we have Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges. He lived from 1745 until 1799. He was an Afro-French composer, a violinist, and conductor. He won his first fame not as a musician, but as France's best fencer. So he was a sword fighter. A fencer is a sword fighter. So he was a champion, and he won his first fame as France's best sword fighter. He was born Joseph de Boulogne on December 25th, 1745, on a plantation near Basse-Terre on the French Caribbean island of Guadeloupe. He was the son of a slave woman of African descent and a French plantation owner. He was educated in France. De Boulogne was only 19 when his mastery of the violin and the harpsichord earned him a dedication from the great violinist composer Antonio Lolli in 1764. More acclaim came from Francois-Joseph Grossec in 1766 and Karl Stamnitz in 1770. Both of those guys were famous composers in those days. By 1771, Saint-Georges was first violin of a distinguished 70-member ensemble, Le Concert des Amateurs. He became one of the earliest French composers of French quartets and symphony concertantes. His first string quartets were performed in 1772 and published in 1773, the year in which he was appointed conductor. He later conducted Le Concert de la Loge Olympique, with which he premiered Haydn's Paris symphonies in 1787. And finally, Le Cercle de l'Harmonie. Saint-Georges directed an important private musical theater where some of his own songs and musicals were performed. Here is an example of Saint-Georges' music. Now, it's important to remember that he was a contemporary of Mozart, living at the same time, during the same years as Mozart. And you will notice that his music has a similar sound to Mozart. Not necessarily because he was copying Mozart, but because that was the sound of the day. So if you think about any music today, possibly hip hop, they have a similar quality to them. You know, they're very rhythmic and, you know, there's a similar quality as compared to jazz or to R&B from the 60s and 70s or something like that. I mean, there's an identifying quality about this music. And this is the way that it was back in this time as well. So here is some of Saint-Georges' music. Okay, so we're going to go on. Our next composer is Jose Mauricio Nunez Garcia. He lived from 1767 to 1830. He was an Afro-Brazilian and a Roman Catholic priest. He was an organist and chapel master in the Cathedral of Rio de Janeiro. Most of his music was liturgical, which means that it was religious, came from the liturgy. About 240 of his works survive. In 1817, Garcia wrote Brazil's first opera, Les Deux Jumelles, The Two Twins, which was later destroyed by fire. Here is a piece performed by Camerata Vocal Sin Nomine of Havana, Cuba. This is a wonderful men's singing group. Our next composer is George Bridgetower. George Bridgetower lived from 1780 until 1860. He was a child prodigy with an African father and a German mother. As a child, he joined the retinue of the Prince of Wales, who later became George IV. He arranged music studies with established musicians. In 1802, Bridgetower obtained permission to travel to the continent to visit his mother. In the spring of 1803, he met Beethoven, who quickly wrote his Sonata for Violin and Piano, Opus 47, for Bridgetower. Beethoven played the piano and Bridgetower played the violin at the highly successful premiere of the sonata in Vienna on May 24, 1803. Before the work was published, the two men had a disagreement, causing Beethoven to replace Bridgetower's name on the manuscript with that of Rudolf Kreutzer. Here is a sample of this music.
I'm not sure too many musicians can say that Beethoven composed a piece for them, but George Augustus Polbreen Bridgetower can say just that. He was born in Poland to a German mother and West Indian father. Both his parents served European aristocrats, which meant that George grew up in a castle complete with a puppet theatre and opera house. Like Mozart, he was a child prodigy and toured with his violin to places such as Bath, Bristol, and London. One French journal said, "His talent is one of the best replies one can give to philosophers who wish to deprive people of his nation and his colour of the opportunity to distinguish themselves in the arts." George came to Trinity Hall in 1811 at the age of 30 to complete a bachelor's degree in music. To earn this, he had to do an exercise which involved writing a musical composition to poetry and performing it with a full orchestra at Great St. Mary's Church. Fluent in English, German, French, Italian, and Polish, he mixed with royalty and musicians across Europe. He was a great friend of Beethoven, who called him a virtuoso and composed for him a sonata for pianoforte and violin in A. George even made some alterations to the violin part, which Beethoven responded to by saying, "Noch einmal, mein lieber Bursch." Unfortunately, George and Beethoven fell out after George insulted a female friend of Beethoven's. Beethoven was so incensed that he actually scratched out the dedication to George and gave it to another violinist called Kreutzer, who didn't even attempt to play the piece, saying that it was too hard. Since his death at the age of 81 in Peckham in South London, there have been many more dedications to George that haven't been scratched out, dedications that appear in films, plays, and even in a jazz opera. As I reflect on the life of George Bridgetower, I am so amazed at how excellent this man was. I think it's interesting that throughout history, many Black people have been omitted, scratched out, or censored. But today we are curating and we're remembering someone who was an excellent violinist, an excellent person in the field of classical music. And it's just a representation of how Black excellence continues to thrive today.
Our next musician and composer is Francis Frank B. Johnson. He lived from 1792 to 1844. He was American. He was a Philadelphia bugler and band leader. He was the most popular Black composer in the pre-Civil War United States. He published his first work, a collection of new cotillions, in Philadelphia in 1819. Johnson's band soon became the leading musical group for social events and marches in the region. Despite their popularity, racial violence broke out during at least one of their concerts. The members were also arrested and fined in St. Louis for entering the state of Missouri as free Blacks without official permission. And this is just unbelievable, but it's the way that things were then. In 1837, Johnson and his band members became the first African-American musicians to travel to Europe to perform. Their triumphant return to the United States in 1838 generated more notoriety as they now performed outdoor promenade concerts throughout the Northeast. Johnson composed Honor to the Brave, General Lafayette's Grand March, which became a popular tribute to the French military leader who helped the United States win its freedom from Great Britain. The composition can be heard on the CD, The Music of Francis Johnson and His Contemporaries, Early 19th Century Black Composers. for two wonderful musicians, Charles Lucien Lambert and Edmond Dede. They were both members of the Negro Philharmonic Society. This organization was founded in New Orleans well before the Civil War. The orchestra at one point had more than 100 performers, including a few white members. Its director, Constantin Duberg, was a Black violinist. Racial hostility put an end to the society prior to the Civil War. Two of its former members, Edmond Dede, who lived from 1827 to 1903, and Charles Lucien Lambert, who lived from 1828 to 1896, they fled New Orleans in the 1850s and made successful careers in France and Brazil. Dede graduated from the Paris Conservatory and worked as a conductor in Bordeaux, France for 27 years. In the early 20th century, there were other orchestras, including the Clef Club Orchestra of Harlem, New York, which boasted a membership of 125 musicians of African descent. Here is Mephisto Masque for piano, written by Edmond Dede. Such beautiful music. I don't want to stop listening to it. It's stunning. It's stunning. All right, so we're going to move on. Our next composer is Justin Holland. He lived from 1819 until 1887. Holland was a classical guitarist who composed and arranged hundreds of works, which were widely played in the 19th century. After two periods at the Oberlin Conservatory in Ohio, he became Cleveland's first Black professional classical musician and music teacher. He also was a civil rights activist and worked in the same national circles as abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Let's listen to some of his music. We're now going to talk about Jose Silvestre White. He lived from 1835 until 1918. He was an Afro-Cuban violinist who excelled as a student at the Paris Conservatory and later served as a professor there for many years. During the 1875-1876 season, White performed twice with the New York Philharmonic under conductor Theodore Thomas. This photo was taken after he received first prize at the Conservatoire de Paris in 1856. Here is his concerto para violin, or concerto for violin. Okay, so I'm going to stop it. You know, it's so hard for me to stop it because it is so stunning and so beautiful and so sophisticated and so complex. You know, just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful writing and beautiful playing. Samuel Coleridge Taylor, 1875 to 1912. He was an Afro-British composer who wrote Hiawatha's Wedding Feast in 1898. He called himself an Anglo-African and fought against race prejudice all his short life. He incorporated Black traditional music with concert music in such compositions as African Suite, African Romances, and 24 Negro Melodies. The first performance of Hiawatha's Wedding Feast was described by the principal of the Royal College of Music as one of the most remarkable events in modern English musical history. And this work was acclaimed on both sides of the Atlantic. Here is his African Suite.